Beneath the roaring heart of Rome's Colosseum, where torchlight trembled against stone and every breath tasted of rust and fear, the Empire hid its darkest machinery. Not the battles, not the lions. Something deeper, engineered, perfected. A ritual designed to break conquered nations long after their armies fell silent. And on one blistering afternoon in 79 AD, a 19-year-old captive named Sabina stepped into that unseen world. A world where a gladiator's victory granted him power no law dared question, and where a woman's fate could vanish into chambers carved for suffering. But before her story begins, ask yourself the question Rome spent centuries trying to erase. If the greatest empire of the ancient world built beauty above ground, what did it bury beneath its monuments that was never meant to be seen again? The Colosseum shuddered like a living creature that afternoon, its stone ribs vibrating beneath the weight of 50,000 voices. Above, sunlight burned gold across the upper tiers, but below, far below, everything tightened into darkness. Here the torches hissed, their flames dragged sideways by drafts leaking through ancient vents. The corridors felt carved not by Roman hands, but by something older, hungrier. Every echo seemed to belong to the dead. Sabina felt that hunger as she stood shackled in the corner of a cell barely large enough to stretch her legs. 19 years old, the last daughter of a broken northern tribe, she listened to the thunder above her, the roar that followed the death of her brothers at the hands of Rome's newest champion. The sound didn't fade. It rolled through stone. It vibrated in her ribs. It turned grief into a physical weight she couldn't drop. When the cell door crashed open, its iron hinges screaming, she didn't flinch. She had no reactions left to give. 2 guards stepped inside, shadows more than men, their armor scraping like wet gravel as they reached for her chains. She was dragged into the corridor where dozens of other captives waited, each marked with chalk symbols on their arms, tribe, rank, intended use. Rome didn't see people, Rome saw categories. Sabina's chalk mark, a crooked triangle, meant she belonged to the ritual allotment, a classification carved out of bureaucracy so cold it felt almost modern. There was no trial, no reasoning, only assignment. They marched her forward, the underground halls unfolding like the throat of some massive beast. Cages rattled with terrified animals waiting for their turn to die under the sun. The scent of pitch, sweat, and old blood clung to the walls. Somewhere deeper in the maze, drums echoed, rehearsal for the next performance. There were always more performances. Sabina's steps faltered when she passed the metal grate overlooking the hypogeum central loading shaft. From there she saw the wooden platform rising, a gladiator ascending from below to the crowd above. The man on it was enormous, his muscles coiled beneath blood-slick armor. Gas Valerius Maximus, the gladiator responsible for erasing the last of her family only minutes earlier. She saw his laurel wreath tied to his wrist, a symbol of victory. She felt her chest tighten with a grief too deep to voice. She wanted to scream his name, curse him, rip the platform apart with her bare hands, but the sound of Roman horns drowned out every thought. Gas disappeared toward the arena, swallowed by the light, while Sabina and the others continued downward, into places the sun had never touched. The corridor widened into a staging hall where captives were separated with an efficiency that felt unnatural. Scribes sat behind elevated desks, dipping sharpened reeds into ink as they recorded every woman who passed. Height, hair color, tribal affiliation, condition, potential value. The scribes didn't look at the bodies in front of them. They looked through them, treating each person like an entry on a ledger. Sabina's wrists were rubbed raw by the chains, but she held her head upright, refusing to give Rome the bowed posture it expected. A scribe scribbled something beside her number, frowned, then waved her into the next chamber. Inside that chamber, the preparations began. Guards with buckets moved along the line of captives. The water was freezing cold, splashing against skin already bruised from transport. The women were scrubbed down hurriedly, their hair combed, their clothing replaced with plain tunics. The process felt ritualistic, almost ceremonial, but everyone knew the ceremony existed only to sanitize despair. Sabina's breath caught as she felt the bucket water run down her neck. Her mother used to wash her hair beside a river shaded by oak trees. The memory was so vivid it nearly collapsed her from the inside out. An older woman, a priestess from Sabina's homeland, leaned close as the guards passed. Her voice was a whisper carved from dread. "They're preparing us for the surface, or for something worse." Her eyes flicked toward the ceiling, toward the arena where the crowd still shook the earth. Sabina followed the gaze and felt her stomach turn. Rome loved turning human suffering into spectacle, but today, whatever they were preparing was not just spectacle, it was message, punishment crafted with intention. Moments later, trumpets above signaled the end of a major fight, and a new surge of noise thundered down through the stone. The guards moved quickly. 20 women, including Sabina, were taken to the vertical lift platform. The wooden structure creaked under their weight. Sabina's heart pounded as the mechanism jerked upward. In seconds, the cold shadows below gave way to blinding sunlight. Heat slapped her skin. Noise tore at her ears. The Colosseum erupted around her like a beast delighted by fresh prey. She stumbled forward into the arena. The sand beneath her feet, the legendary sand, was a mosaic of old stains. Some dark, some almost black, all reminders. The crowd stared down with the hungry fascination of people who believed watching suffering made them powerful. Above the emperor's seat fluttered banners of crimson and gold, snapping in the wind. A herald strode into the centre with theatrical grandeur and announced their supposed crimes: rebellion, sacrilege, defiance. Words crafted to justify anything Rome wanted to do next. Then came the twist. The moment Sabina realized Rome wasn't content with killing her people, it wanted to desecrate them. From behind the partitions, attendants carried wooden swords and tossed one at the feet of each captive. The herald declared that the women would fight each other in pairs, not to survive, not to escape, but to entertain. The winners would be awarded, a word that meant something too dark for the crowd to say aloud. The losers would be killed. The audience loved it. They surged forward, shouting, laughing, tossing coins in anticipation. Sabina's partner stepped into view. Cassius, her childhood friend, her late fiancé's sister. The woman who once braided her hair beside the fires of their village. The woman who sang the last song of mourning when the Romans took their homeland. For a moment the two simply stared at each other, devastated and rooted in place. The crowd wanted violence. Instead, it received silence. Sabina lifted her wooden sword. So did Cassius. Neither moved. A pressure fell over the arena, heavy and expectant. Confusion rippled through the stands, then anger. The crowd began to chant, the chant turning into jeers, the jeers into projectiles flung toward the women. Food scraps, stones, broken pottery. Everything became a weapon hurled from the safety of the stands. Sabina's breath trembled as an olive pit struck her cheek. Cassius swallowed hard, refusing to break her stance. 90 seconds passed. 90 seconds during which 2 unarmed young women stood defiant before the greatest empire on earth, refusing to become props in its theatre of humiliation. The moment felt frozen, suspended between silence and fury. Then the spell shattered. Guards stormed into the arena. One struck Cassius from behind with the flat of a blade, sending her collapsing into the sand. Sabina screamed, dropping her wooden sword and lunging toward her friend, but rough hands seized her arms, twisting them until her joints ached. The crowd roared in approval, their thirst satisfied by the sudden burst of real violence. Sabina and Cassius were dragged toward the same lift they ascended minutes earlier, but not back to the holding cells. They were taken deeper, past the chambers meant for prisoners, past the animal cages, down a forbidden hallway lined with stone rooms. Rooms built not for public spectacle, but for private rites Rome never acknowledged. These were the allocation chambers. Here the walls were too smooth, too reinforced for improvisation. Iron rings were embedded. At calculated intervals, benches lined the edges. Torches illuminated the stone floor, marked by old drainage grooves. Everything was arranged with disturbing precision. This was not chaos. This was engineering. a system perfected through years of practice. A clerk nearby recorded their arrival with mechanical indifference. 20 female captives processed, 2 resistant, transferred for exclusive handling. His stylus scratched the wax tablet without hesitation. The women were split apart. Cassius dragged into one chamber, Sabina into another. The door slammed shut behind her with a finality that stabbed like a blade. Inside, Sabina felt the walls closing in. Not physically, but spiritually. Everything in the room radiated one idea. Rome had designed this chamber for a purpose that stripped identity and memory. She backed into a corner, her breath shallow, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She didn't pray, she didn't scream. She simply braced herself because that was all she had left. Minutes passed. Torches flickered. Steps approached. The door opened. Gas Valerius Maximus, the man who killed her brothers, stepped inside, still wearing armour smeared with the blood of other men. The laurel wreath hung from his wrist. His chest rose with uneven breaths. He had earned his victory, and by Roman custom he had earned what came next. Sabina froze, pressing herself against the wall, every instinct bracing for the worst. But what happened next was something no Roman scribe, no senator, no spectator would ever believe. Gas removed his helmet and set it gently on the ground. He sat on the stone bench. He covered his face with both hands and said nothing. The silence was unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like a man confronting a ghost. "What was his name?" he asked in broken fragments of her language. Sabina stared, confused. "The man? They made you watch die." She whispered the name. He bowed his head. And in that impossible moment, in a chamber built for cruelty, something long forbidden in Rome's machinery flickered back to life. Humanity. Gas sat with his head bowed for a long trembling moment, and in that dim chamber built for cruelty, Sabina waited like someone bracing for a storm she could neither stop nor outrun. But the violence she feared never came. Instead, Gas spoke with a brokenness that felt older than the arena itself, confessing how the Empire had carved him into a weapon, long before he understood what freedom meant, how he'd been enslaved at 9 and forced to kill for survival, how every victory stripped him further from the boy he once was, and how seeing her brother fall that afternoon shattered something inside him he didn't know still existed. Sabina didn't trust him, not fully, not yet, but as he described the years he spent fighting to stay alive, she recognized in his voice the same grief that lived in her bones, a recognition that didn't excuse his hands, didn't erase what he'd done, but revealed the truth Rome never allowed its victims to see, that even its champions were prisoners. 2 guard checks passed, each one glancing inside, hearing voices and assuming what the system expected to happen was happening. They moved on without suspicion, unaware that a gladiator and a captive were rewriting their roles in silence. As the torches outside dimmed toward evening, Gas finally stood, his decision set with the finality of a man who knew he might be punished for it. When he called for the guard and claimed Sabina was infected, refusing the allocation and demanding she be sent to the physician, the lie was obvious, but the bureaucracy behind these walls was designed for speed, not scrutiny, and the guards, tired, indifferent, dragged Sabina away without argument. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't force her head to turn. She didn't want the last thing she saw to be the man who killed her brothers sitting in a doorway looking like he wished he hadn't. The infirmary she was taken to was a crowded room that smelled of damp straw and neglect, a place where the Empire stored wounded prisoners the way it stored broken equipment. And though Gas had spared her from one kind of horror, he couldn't shield her from the infection already spreading through her arm, a small wound earned weeks earlier, now burning with fever. For 3 days she slipped in and out of consciousness, whispering memories of home, remembering her brother's voices carried on highland winds, feeling her mother's hands braiding her hair beside river stones. The world above her roared with festivals, but down here she faded quietly, unrecorded, unnoticed, a life extinguished in the shadows of the monument that celebrated conquest. When she died before dawn on the 4th day, no one spoke her name, no one wrote it, No one marked her passing except a scribe who scratched a number on a tablet already smeared with earlier numbers, Rome's silent arithmetic of lives it deemed disposable. Meanwhile Gas fought again, and again, each victory deepening the whispers in the barracks. Maximus had refused his spoils, Maximus had broken tradition, Maximus had shown compassion, an idea so dangerous Rome feared it more than rebellion. The murmur spread until a senator's nephew, inspired by Gas, refused his own reward and was beaten for it. A single incident that forced Rome's elite to confront the ritual everyone knew existed but no one dared acknowledge publicly. The Senate argued for hours. Traditionalists insisted Rome's dominance depended on humiliating the conquered, while reformers warned that these spectacles were breeding rage in every province, fueling uprisings rather than suppressing them, and governors sent frantic reports showing that memories of this mistreatment were becoming political weapons in enemy hands. Eventually, politics, not morality, forced the Senate to pass the Lex Captiva, banning the public distribution and staged humiliation of female captives. The law was riddled with loopholes, ignored by many, enforced poorly, but it marked something Rome had avoided for generations, a line in the sand the empire admitted it should not cross. Gas won his freedom months later, not for mercy, but for victories paid for in blood. Before leaving Rome, he used his earnings to purchase the freedom of a woman named Cassius, the same woman who had stood beside Sabina in defiance in the arena. But the records say nothing more about her, nothing about where she went, whether she survived, whether she carried Sabina's memory or buried it to build a new life far from the empire that stole everything from them. Gas disappeared too. Some legends whispered he returned to the northern woods. Others claimed he died quietly in anonymity, a man seeking forgiveness no one could give. And Sabina lived only in the spaces where Rome tried to erase her. The missing lines in Dio's accounts, the uneasy silence in Tacitus's writings, the small chambers uncovered in the 2018 excavation, with their restraints carved directly into the walls, the bronze tags stamped with dates matching the years her people were taken. These forgotten rooms beneath the Colosseum reveal a truth Rome hid beneath stone and spectacle. That its grandeur was built not just with engineering and empire, but with suffering pushed out of sight so the crowds above could cheer without guilt. Sabina left no statue, no inscription, no recorded lineage, yet her story endures because it exposes the dark machinery behind Rome's greatest monument and reminds us that empires aren't judged by the arches they raise, but by the shadows those arches cast, and by the voices buried beneath them.